Welcome to Dabla. Don't forget to subscribe. Imagine a humid afternoon in June 1995. You are standing in the heart of Seoul, South Korea, inside a building that represents the very pinnacle of the nation's economic miracle on the Han River. The Sampoong Department Store is a shimmering palace of consumerism painted in a distinct prestige pink that glows under the summer sun. Inside, the air is cool, scented with the musk of high-end perfumes and the aroma of expensive delicacies from the basement food hall. 5,000 people are milling through the aisles, blissfully unaware that the floor beneath their feet is vibrating with a frequency that signals the end of the world. At 5:52 p.m., a sound like a thunderclap erupts from the ceiling. It isn't a bomb and it isn't an earthquake. In exactly 20 seconds, the south wing of this massive complex, 5 floors of reinforced concrete, glass and thousands of tons of luxury goods, will collapse vertically into the basement. It is a pancake collapse, the most lethal structural failure a building can suffer. By the time the dust settles, over 500 people will be dead, crushed under a weight they could never have imagined. But the most shocking revelation isn't just the structural failure itself, it's the fact that just 4 hours before the collapse, the directors of the building sat in a boardroom looking at cracks in the ceiling wide enough to fit a human arm through, and they decided to keep the doors open because they didn't want to lose a single afternoon's profit. Later in this video, we are going to dive into the secret of the ghost floor, a massive, unauthorized modification that turned a structural masterpiece into a 45,000-ton guillotine. We will uncover how a building that was officially certified as safe by city inspectors and built by one of the most powerful conglomerates in the country could fail so catastrophically in broad daylight. This wasn't a freak accident of nature, it was a calculated series of engineering crimes. To understand how this happened, we have to look at the object itself. The Sampoong Department Store was a beast of a building. It consisted of 2 main wings, north and south, connected by an atrium that felt more like a cathedral than a mall. It stood 5 stories above the ground and reached 4 levels into the earth. To give you an idea of the sheer scale, the total floor space was nearly 100,000 square meters. That is the equivalent of 14 professional soccer pitches stacked on top of one another. Every single day, 40,000 people walk through those doors. That is like moving the entire population of a mid-sized city through a single building every 24 hours. The store was generating roughly $4 million in sales every day in 1995 currency. If you adjust that for inflation today, we are talking about a building that was printing enough money to buy several luxury mansions every single time the sun set. The structure was built using a flat slab system, which in engineering terms is both elegant and incredibly dangerous if not executed perfectly. Unlike a traditional beam and girder system, where thick horizontal beams carry the weight of the floor to the columns, a flat slab design relies on the concrete floor itself to transfer the load directly into the pillars. Imagine a waiter carrying a massive, heavy tray on the tips of 4 fingers. There are no supports under the edges of the tray. All the pressure is concentrated exactly where the fingers meet the metal. If the tray is too heavy or the fingers are too thin, the tray doesn't just tilt, it punches right through. This is what engineers call punching shear. In the Sampoong building, the tray was a slab of concrete that weighed as much as a fleet of Boeing 747s, and the fingers were columns that were being secretly sabotaged from the inside. What makes the Sampoong story so chilling is the illusion of security. This wasn't some back alley construction project built by amateurs in the middle of nowhere. This was a flagship project in the Seochugu district, the most affluent part of Seoul. It was designed by professional architects and constructed under the eyes of the city's building department. It had passed every fire drill, every structural audit, and every legal hurdle required by the South Korean government. On paper, the building was invincible. It was certified to withstand heavy seismic loads and was praised for its modern aesthetic. The public trusted the pink walls. They trusted the A ratings from the safety inspectors. They walked into that building every day believing that the concrete above their heads was a solid, unshakable shield. But as we will see, the legal paperwork was nothing more than a facade. Behind the shiny marble and the glass elevators, the very bones of the building had been hollowed out by greed, and the clock was already ticking towards zero. The collapse of the Sampoong Department Store didn't begin with the first crack in the ceiling in 1995. It began 6 years earlier in the blueprints and the boardroom. Originally, the site was never intended to be a department store at all. The land was zoned for a 4-story office residential building, but as the miracle on the Han River sent South Korea's economy into the stratosphere, the chairman of the Sampoong Group, Lee Jun, saw a more lucrative opportunity. He wanted a palace of luxury. This decision was the first domino. When the original contractors, Wusong Construction, were told to add a 5th floor and cut through critical load-bearing walls to install escalators, they refused. They told Lee Jun that the building would become unstable. His response? He fired them. He brought in his own construction company to finish the job, a move that effectively removed any independent oversight or professional pushback. The technical betrayal that followed is staggering. To make room for the escalators, engineers had to cut away support beams, transferring the weight of the building to the columns alone. But Lee Jun's team went further. To maximize the retail floor space, they reduced the diameter of the support columns from 80 centimeters to 60 centimeters. On paper, 20 centimeters might not seem like much, but in the world of physics, this was a death sentence. By reducing the diameter, they reduced the cross-sectional area of the support and thus its load capacity by nearly 44%. It's the difference between holding up a roof with a sturdy tree trunk or a thin plastic pipe. Furthermore, the number of steel reinforcement bars, the rebar inside those columns, was slashed from 16 to 8. They weren't just making the building lighter, they were hollowing out its skeleton. Then came the ghost floor. The 5th floor was originally meant to be a roller rink. However, halfway through construction, the plan changed to a series of traditional Korean restaurants. This seemingly simple aesthetic choice added an astronomical amount of weight. Traditional Korean dining involves sitting on the floor, which requires on-dole floor heating. To install this, workers had to lay down a thick layer of concrete pipes and water, adding a massive 1 meter of additional slab thickness. This dead load was equivalent to parking an extra 2,000 full-sized SUVs on the top floor of the building. The structure was now supporting nearly double the weight it was ever designed for. It was a 45,000-ton giant standing on ankles made of glass. But the final fatal blow wasn't the floor, it was the roof. To keep the elite shoppers of Seoul comfortable, 3 massive air conditioning units were installed on the rooftop. Together, these units weighed 45 tons. When neighbors complained about the noise, the management decided to move them. Instead of using a crane, which would have been the expensive, safe way, they decided to save money by putting the units on rollers and dragging them across the roof. This act was the engineering equivalent of scoring a pane of glass before breaking it. As the 45-ton units were dragged, they created deep structural cracks in the roof slab, specifically around column 5E. Think of the yield strength of the concrete. Every material has a limit where it can no longer return to its original shape. By dragging those units, the Sampoong managers pushed the concrete beyond its yield strength, creating microscopic fractures that began to eat away at the structural integrity. Every time those AC units were switched on, the vibration sent rhythmic shocks through the weakened roof. This is known as cyclic loading. It's like bending a paperclip back and forth. Eventually, it just snaps. By the morning of June 29th, column 5E had begun to buckle. The angle of inclination of the floor was shifting. The building was screaming in the language of physics, but the people in charge were only looking at the sales figures. They had reached the point of no return, where the gravity pulling the building down was officially stronger than the steel holding it up. The punching shear failure was no longer a possibility, it was a mathematical certainty. The morning of June 29, 1995, began not with a bang, but with a series of quiet, ominous warnings. At 8 a.m., a manager entering the 5th floor restaurant noticed a massive crack in the floor around the central column. It was deep enough that you could drop a coin into it and never hear it hit bottom. By midday, the ceiling of the 5th floor had begun to sag visibly. The owner of the restaurant reported that the floor was vibrating so violently that customers were complaining their soup was splashing out of their bowls. Instead of evacuating, the management simply closed the 5th floor and moved the expensive merchandise to the basement. They told the shoppers it was a temporary gas leak. This lie was worth exactly $300,000, the estimated revenue for that single afternoon. They chose the cash over the lives of 5,000 people. At 5:40 p.m., the situation became undeniable. Loud bangs echoed through the atrium, the sound of steel reinforcement bars snapping under the immense tension. These bars are designed to stretch before they break, a property called ductility, but the load was so extreme they were shattering like glass. At 5:50 p.m., the fifth floor ceiling began to peel away from the columns. The punching shear we discussed earlier was finally happening. At 5:52 p.m., the ultimate failure occurred. A single column on the top floor gave way, and within less than a second, the entire weight of the roof crashed into the fifth floor. It took exactly 20 seconds for the south wing to disappear. That is less time than it takes to read a single paragraph of this script. It was a pancake collapse. In this type of failure, the kinetic energy of the falling floor is so massive that the floor below cannot possibly stop it. Each level adds more mass and more velocity. By the time the fifth floor hit the fourth, it was moving with the force of a freight train. When it hit the ground, the impact was registered by seismic sensors across Seoul. 5 stories of luxury shopping, reinforced concrete, and human life were compressed into a pile of rubble just a few meters high. The immediate aftermath was a scene of apocalyptic chaos. A massive cloud of pink dust and pulverized concrete rose over the city, obscuring the sun. Thousands of civilians, taxi drivers, and nearby shopkeepers didn't wait for the fire department. They ran toward the dust, digging with their bare hands. They found people crushed in elevators, people trapped under slabs of marble, and hundreds of bodies that were unrecognizable. The official toll was staggering: 502 people dead and 937 injured. To visualize that loss, it is as if every single person in a large apartment complex was wiped out in the blink of an eye. Yet, amid the horror, there were the miracles of Sampoong. For days, rescue workers labored under the constant threat of the remaining north wing collapsing. They found Cho Myung-sok after 11 days. He had survived by drinking rainwater that seeped through the cracks. 2 days later, they found Yoo Ji-hwan after 13 days. And finally, in a moment that stopped the entire nation, 19-year-old Park Sung-hyun was pulled from the wreckage after 17 days. She had spent 377 hours in total darkness, trapped in a pocket of air the size of a coffin, with no food or water. Her survival remains one of the most incredible feats of human endurance in modern history. While the city mourned, the investigation began, led by Professor Lan Chung. When he entered the site, he found something that turned his stomach. He looked at the columns that were supposed to be the backbone of the building. Not only were they too thin, but the drop panels, the thick concrete squares meant to distribute the weight of the floor to the column, were missing. In their place were thin aesthetic caps. The engineers had prioritized pretty over permanent. Furthermore, the investigation uncovered a web of corruption that reached the highest levels of local government. Officials had been bribed with thousands of dollars to sign off on building permits without ever stepping foot on the construction site. The punishment, however, felt like a second tragedy to many. The chairman, Lee Jun, was arrested and charged with criminal negligence. During his trial, he famously stated to the press, "The collapse of a building is just a loss for the company. The loss of life is just a tragedy for the victims." This cold-blooded admission of corporate greed sparked riots. He was sentenced to only 7.5 years in prison. For the families of the 502 people who died, that amounted to just 5 days of prison time for every life lost. The building was gone, the miracle was exposed as a fraud, and the survivors were left to wonder how a modern society could allow its citizens to be crushed by the weight of a few extra dollars. The dust of the Sampoong Department Store didn't just settle on the streets of Seoul, it settled on the conscience of an entire nation. In the weeks following the disaster, South Korea underwent a structural soul-searching that would redefine the country's relationship with its own ambition. The government, reeling from public fury and international embarrassment, launched a massive nationwide safety audit of every single high-rise building, bridge and tunnel constructed during the construction boom of the 1980s and 90s. The results were nothing short of a horror story. Out of the 498 high-rise buildings inspected, only 2%, just 10 buildings, were found to be fully safe and structurally sound. To put that into a relatable comparison, imagine walking into a hospital where 98 out of every 100 surgical tools are contaminated or broken. That was the state of the miracle on the Han River. Roughly 81% of the buildings required major structural repairs and 16% were so fundamentally unstable that they were ordered to be demolished immediately. This was the terrifying echo of tragedy. The Sampoong collapse wasn't a localized accident, it was a symptom of a systemic disease known as pari-pari culture. In Korean, pari-pari means hurry-hurry. It was the engine that drove South Korea from a war-torn agrarian society to a global tech giant in just 30 years. But the Sampoong disaster proved that, when you build at the speed of light, you often leave the laws of physics behind. The reforms that followed were some of the most stringent in the world. The South Korean government passed the Special Act on Safety Control for Infrastructure, which mandated that all buildings over a certain size undergo rigorous, independent structural audits every few years. They stripped the power of safety certification away from local politicians who were easily bribed and handed it to specialized, state-monitored engineering boards. The K-design standard for concrete was overhauled, doubling the required safety factors for punching shear resistance. Engineers were no longer just advisors, they were given the legal authority to shut down a construction site immediately if they saw a single unauthorized modification. We must also look at the historical context. Just 8 months before Sampoong, the Seongsu Bridge, a major artery across the Han River, simply snapped in half during the morning rush hour, killing 32 people. The lessons were right there, written in the twisted metal of the bridge, yet they were ignored by the Sampoong group. This is why the Sampoong disaster is often cited as a mirror of systemic decisions. It represents the moment when a society realizes that the yield strength of a community is just as important as the yield strength of its steel. If the social contract, the trust that the ceiling won't fall on your head while you buy groceries, is broken, the entire nation begins to crumble from within. Today, if you visit the site in the Seochegu district where the prestige Pink Palace once stood, you won't find a memorial at the exact location. Instead, you will see the Daerim Akrovista, a massive, ultra-luxury apartment complex that was completed in 2004. For some, this is a sign of resilience. For others, it is a haunting reminder of how quickly we pave over our tragedies. The official memorial to the 502 victims was placed in Yangjae Citizens Forest, miles away from the actual site, a decision that remains controversial to this day. The story of the Sampoong Department Store is more than just a case study in load capacity and metal fatigue. It is a warning that echoes across every mega project currently being built in the world today. It reminds us that every time a developer asks an engineer to cut a few corners to save on logistics or material costs, they are essentially gambling with human lives. In the end, gravity doesn't care about your profit margins, it doesn't care about your political connections or your corporate reputation. Gravity is the ultimate auditor and it always collects its debt. What do you think? Should the directors of such projects face life imprisonment for negligence, or is the systemic culture of speed the real criminal here? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into the Sampoong disaster informative, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We have plenty more stories of human ambition and engineering failures coming your way. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.